I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today because I have a prior commitment in another country. However, I would like to share with you some of the problems India is facing right now in terms of water. There is no question in my mind India will have a big problem in terms of water within the coming 10 to 20 years. In fact, based on the analyses we have done, it's almost 99.99% sure within the next 20 years, at least 10 to 12 cities of India will run into major water problem because of poor water management. India's water management has been on an unsustainable path for at least 40 years. And the sad thing is neither the government nor the politicians have given water enough emphasis or thought how to improve the situation. Much has been talked about that India's water is not enough. On the contrary, I would argue that India has more than enough water, not only for now, but also for 2050, when India's population will go up from about 1.35 billion to 1.76 billion. That means within little over 30 years, we'll be adding 400 million people to India's population. In addition to that, as our middle class are exploding, this means water requirement will be increasing as well. For example, as people's standard of living increases, their dietary habits changes very much. And we go from a poor diet to a rather rich, protein-rich diet. And production of protein-rich diet, meat, milk, fish, vegetables, means we need more water to produce a rich protein diet. Even for vegetarians, if we look at India's milk product consumption, like yogurt, ice cream, and milk, they are exploding. So it means we need to make sure that enough water is available to produce a protein-rich diet, which is much better than what it is now. So to do that, we of course need expansion, how to expand agricultural production significantly. Equally, as India's population increases and expectation of the people increases, we have to increase India's industrial requirements, India's energy requirements. And in order to meet with them, we need more and more water. So the only possibility is how to increase significantly India's efficiencies in water consumption, production, not only for the domestic sector, but also agricultural sector, industrial sector, energy sector, environmental sector. But the fact is, India's water management has been on an unsustainable path for at least 40 years. And equally sadly, neither in the government nor in the bureaucracy realize that this has been on an unsustainable path. Only now, Niti Aayog has come out saying India is facing a water crisis. I'm afraid it's 40 years too late. The Planning Commission should have come out 40 years ago and said, we are facing a major water crisis. How can we solve that? Contrary to the common belief, India does not face a shortage of water. What we are facing right now is a crisis created by poor management of water for decades. And we are still, water management leaves much to be desired. And how do we solve this problem? Well, the problem can be solved by improving our water management practices. For example, we have to start thinking what is the situation in India in terms of water. India gets enough rainfall. Most part of India gets more than enough rainfall. But what we are not doing is doing enough to store the water. Surface water storage, groundwater storage, rainwater harvesting, all types of storage, so that the water that falls in the monsoon season can be used throughout the year. If you look at India's water distribution, probably 80% of the rainfall in most of the Indian major cities now occur in no more than, our estimate shows, between 90 to 120 hours, depending on the cities you consider. These 90 to 120 hours are not consecutive, but it just shows tremendous amount of rain falls in a very short period. So the question is, how do we store them? How do we use them effectively? And this problem becomes evident if we look at one of the India's rainiest city, Cherrapunji. Cherrapunji is a city where we don't count rainfall in millimeters. In fact, we count rainfall in meters. Cherrapunji's annual rainfall is about 11,777 millimeter, which translates to 11.7 meters. It's a tremendous amount of rainfall, but even then, Cherrapunji is now having serious water problem, at least for a decade during the non-monsoon years. So the issue is not enough water. The issue is when the water falls, when the rain falls, how do we use it more effectively? Let's see how India stack up with the other countries. If I compare Indian water management with, let's say, United States or Australia, both US and Australia now has approximately 5,000 cubic meters of storage per person. If we take countries like China, Morocco, South Africa, they store about 1,000 cubic meter per person per year. On the other hand, if you look at India, our storage is no more than 200 cubic meters per person per year. So this means we have to increase our storage, all forms of storage, surface water storage, groundwater storage, all types of storage, so that the tremendous rain that falls during the monsoon season can be stored and used during dry season. Now, that is only one issue. The second is water use efficiency in all the sectors in India is extremely poor. Take domestic water uses. Domestic water uses in major cities in India, we don't have exact figures, primarily because the real data is very hard to get, or they simply do not exist. There are no serious water audits of major Indian cities, but our estimate is, at least in a city like Delhi, houses are using 220 liters per person per day. The city of Delhi now loses probably 35 to 40% of water because of unauthorized connections, leakages from the system, and poor management. So in order to get 220 liters per person per day, Delhi has to produce at least 300 liters per person per day, so the 220 liters goes to the household. Now, how does it compare to the rest of the world? Rest of the world, water consumption is coming down dramatically. Singapore did a study in 1965, a 10-year study, where he found out that to have a good quality of living, good standard of health, we only need 75 liters per person per day. More than that is pure aesthetics. It doesn't improve the health conditions, living conditions, or any other thing for that matter. And if we look at what's happening globally, many of the West European cities are coming approximately to that level. For example, if we look at water consumption in Czech Republic, it is now average about 88 liters per person per day. And they don't get sick. They are having a good style of living, significantly higher than the Indian standard of living, and they are doing it all right with 88 liters per person per day. If we look at some of the major cities, Western cities, for example, cities like Leipzig, Barcelona, Saragossa, Tallinn, average water consumption per person per day is 95 liters or less. Denmark has brought it down to 104 liters per person per day. So the question is why these cities and these countries can use so little water and still have a good quality of life. Indians are using too much water for a variety of reasons. First, the water price is highly subsidized in India. In most cities in India, it's either free or highly subsidized. So we have to start thinking about how to reduce water consumption in the domestic sector, in many cases by at least half within the next 10 to 15 years. Second, agriculture, which probably takes 80 to 85% of water use. We have to start looking at how we can increase agricultural production without more water and without more land. The fact is, India doesn't have much extra land or water. Now, if you're going to make sure 400 million extra people coming within the next 30 years, and the existing population expect a much better quality of diet, which all needs much more water, only way to think of is to make sure there is a vertical increase in production rather than horizontal expansion of production. It's difficult to understand, for example, why India's rice production is half that of China. India's cotton production per hectare is again almost half of that of China. If China can do it, why can't India do it? Because we have the expertise, we have the technology, we have actually the investment funds. The problem comes down to poor quality of management. If India can, within the next 15 years, reach China's current level of agricultural productivity, we can cut our agricultural production, water requirements for agricultural productions without any difficulty by at least 30 to 40% without sacrificing yield. All these are doable, and by 2030 or 2035, China's yields are going to increase quite significantly because that is the current way of doing things. In fact, China has already made a plan that between 2014 and 2020, they will reduce their water consumption, agricultural water consumption, by about 30%, and they're en route to that. So we have to start thinking how we can produce more food with less water. Second, we have to start thinking about the food that is produced in India that actually goes for human consumption. The Minister of Agriculture 3 or 4 years ago said in the Parliament that half of fruits and vegetable produce never reach the consumer. 1/3 of the cereal produced do not reach the consumer because they're lost to the pests, poor storage, poor transportation, whole variety of practices. So we have to start thinking about not looking at there is a one-to-one relationship with water and food productions. In fact, it is not. So we have to start deciding how do we reduce the significant food losses by infrastructure development, cold storage, processing of perishable food. For example, we now process about 4% of vegetables and fruits that are produced. If I compare it to Malaysia and Brazil, they are two developing countries, very similar to India. They are now processing at least 50% of their fruits and vegetables so that they are not lost. So India has a solution and plenty of solution, but first we have to realize that we are on an unsustainable path. If we look at the future of India, I'm cautiously optimistic provided some difficult political decisions are made. The day when the water could be provided free or highly subsidized prices to everybody is gone. We have to start thinking of how do we provide clean water to all our people at a reasonable price which they can afford. The poor who cannot afford, they must receive targeted subsidy, not middle class or upper middle class who can pay for it. And until and unless water is looked as an economic and social good, I don't see any solution to India's water problem. The biggest problem India is now facing is for centuries it has been trying to expand its water supply. As our population increased, our water requirements, agriculture, energy sector have increased. We have always expanded our water supply. What we start thinking about now is that as our supplies are now, that could be easily developed, are now over, we need to think over now how to manage demands. Sadly, water demand management is not in the lexicon of Indian water planners and decision makers. The Niti Aayog study, which looked into the efficiency of water management in the various Indian states, sadly doesn't say anything much about how water demand can be managed. So if we can manage our water demand, and there is no other choice, we have to manage our water demand in India, then India's water problem doesn't look so bad. But sadly, this means politicians have to wake up and say that free water is not possible for agriculture, for domestic or for industrial purposes. Yes, the poor should be subsidized to have a good quality of water, good living standard, but not everyone. And unless we think about good water management practices and wastewater management practices, I don't see India's water future bright. And the other problem India is also facing because of decades of mismanagement of wastewater, all the wastewater sources around major cities of India or within or around are heavily contaminated. The Ganges cleanup that is taking place, if it occurs along the plan that is happening right now, or the plans are, as I see it, there's no question in my mind Ganga will be more polluted in 2030 than it is now for a variety of reasons, especially if you look at what might happen during what development might occur within the next 10 to 15 years. So India's water problem is solvable, but not with the current way of doing things. And my guess is politicians are not going to take a sustained interest in water issues for years to come. India's politicians get interested in water only when there's a drought or only when there's a flood. The moment the flood is over and the drought is over, they forget that there is a water problem. And water problems cannot be solved within 6 months or 1 year time frame. We need at 15 to 20 years to plan, execute the plan, construct the infrastructure, make sure everything happens so that it can be done properly. So that is where India's water problem lies. Long-term commitment to water, long-term soft solutions as well. One of the problems India faces, for example, if you compare India's water management to China, last 20 years China had 2 water ministers. Both are technocrats, very knowledgeable about water. In contrast, India had 12 ministers the last 20 years, one of whom lasted all of 1 day. And 3 of the ministers were not, including the current minister, were not exclusively looking at the water problems. They are primarily looking into other problems, other issues, and taking water issues in charge. So unless we get good managers, good politicians interested in water, I don't see how we can solve our water problem. Same goes with the chiefs of the water companies of major cities like Delhi, Chennai, Mumbai, Bangalore, or Hyderabad. They are all IAS officers. Very few of them have any knowledge on water or how to run utility. They don't last more than 18 to 24 months, and the problems are so horrendous, you cannot start understanding the sector, finding a plan, and implementing that plan. It cannot be done until and unless a good head is selected, appointed, and given 6 to 8 years to make the plan a reality. So unless some soft and hard solution is done, India's water problem can only get worse over the years. However, on the positive side, if people become aware that the problems are solvable, that we need to do a different way of water management, there's no reason why India cannot have a bright water future, not only in 10 years' time, but also by 2050 when our population will be 1.76 billion people. So generally, I'm cautiously optimistic, but if we go in the present way, India is facing a water crisis that no other generation before has ever had to face. I hope you have an exciting meeting and come out some solutions, and what is important that these solutions are accepted by the Indian policymakers and bureaucrats so that India's problem can be solved.